Hello, for this video we are talking about food production, and food production is really important, as we've mentioned in a couple of previous videos, because there is a growing population of people on the planet and we obviously need to feed all of them. Now, the main source of food for humans are either animals or plants. If you're vegetarian, it's only going to be plants, obviously, but it can be plants and it can be animals as well. So here I've got a little chain, or a little food chain. We've got our grain, which is, I guess, the plant. That gets eaten by a chicken, and in some cases chickens get eaten by people. Now, what's important to realize is that when the chicken eats the plant material, the grain in this case, that chicken is actually eating it for a reason, and it's going to use the biomass or the energy content in that food for itself. So when it eats that food, it's going to use some of the energy that it gets for movement. It's also going to use some of that for heat production, because a chicken has a constant body temperature, like all mammals, of around about 37 degrees. So some of that energy in that food is used for heat production, but also some of the biomass in there won't be passed on to the humans, because some of that is not digested and it comes out as feces, and that biomass is not passed on. But we also get waste materials such as urine as well, and that is not passed on along the food chain. So you can see that the energy that's in the plant is a proportion of it is used by the chicken for heat and movement, but also the biomass, the actual mass of the substance, is not all passed on either, because it's actually lost or removed from this particular food chain. So the human will get less. Now, if we were to have another scenario where the human was not eating the chicken but was eating the plant material, we could go straight from the plant material to the human, and that means all of the biomass and all of the energy content of that food would be available to the human. And we say therefore that that food chain is more efficient, and it's able, a smaller amount of plant material is able to sustain a larger amount of people, because we are not having this middle section here where some of that energy is lost and some of the biomass is lost. If we were to look at what we call a pyramid of biomass for these two scenarios, we've looked at these in Unit 1, and you don't need to know details of how to make these and draw these as such, but if we have the first scenario where we've got the plant, the chicken and the human, we can see that the biomass in the plant is large. We've got the chicken, but then we've got the biomass in the human, and because we've got this middle section of the chicken, there is a lot less biomass possible for the human level, simply because we've had that middle section there. So we've got the plant material, we've got the chicken and the human. In the second scenario with the red line, maybe I should color code this. There you go. In the second scenario with the human eating the plant, we've got the plant material going straight to the human. So that plant material can sustain or provide a larger biomass possible for the human to use, simply because we've got the chicken that's not there in the middle. We say that this food chain is more efficient, and a smaller amount of land can be used to produce, or the same amount of land can be used to provide more biomass for humans if they are eating the plant straight away, or if they are vegetarian. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone should necessarily become a vegetarian. What it has led to is that we actually try and reduce the amount of energy used by this middle layer of the chickens here. What we want to try and do is try and make sure that the maximum amount of food that goes into the chicken is used for growth. I actually forgot to mention here, a big proportion of that, or a certain proportion of that, does go into growth of the chicken, and that's the biomass that's passed on. But we want to try and make sure we reduce the movement as much as possible, reduce the heat produced as much as possible, so that more of the energy goes towards growing, so that it grows faster, and more energy and biomass is passed on to the human. So how do we do that? Well, we can carry out a process that is called factory farming. Now, with factory farming, it's a term that's used for when we have certain conditions under which these animals are bred. So what we do is we restrict movement, and we also heat the environment. So maybe they're indoors and the environment is heated, and that means less of the energy that's eaten goes towards making or producing heat, and less goes to movement, therefore more goes to growth. And this is simply done by restricting movement, keeping them in a very small confined area and keeping them heated and keeping them fed as often as possible. Now there are pros and cons to this, which we'll look at towards the end, but a lot of people don't like this simply because of the kind of cruel conditions that these animals are kept in. The alternative to that is to have what we often call free range or organic food and vegetables, but in terms of the food we're talking about chickens here, and these chickens are allowed to move around. They're more free to have, they've got more space to move around in, and they're outdoors, and they're probably under less cruel conditions than the chickens that are factory farmed. Now the problem with this though, in terms of food production, is that more energy goes for movement, more goes to heat because they're outside in the cooler conditions, and less energy, less of that food intake goes towards growth. So that means these will take longer to grow, but on the other hand they're kept in better conditions. So that's one aspect of food production that we look at, is to do with food chains and the efficiency of food chains and keeping them as short as possible in order to improve efficiency. But another section that we need to look at is to do with fishing. And fishing, as we know, provides a lot of food for people, but there are problems in that the numbers of fish, the different species of fish that are edible by humans, are reducing drastically, almost to the point where some of them are endangered and may possibly become extinct in a short period of time. Now, one way in which this is trying to be controlled is by using a variety of rules and regulations in order to make sure that these fish don't all get used up and become extinct. And the different measures are, for example, net size. So smaller net sizes means we catch less fish, so more of them can survive to move on and reproduce. Quotas, that means just having a certain number that you're allowed to catch. Avoiding fishing during mating season, this obviously allows the fish to reproduce and therefore keep the numbers up. Avoiding the breeding grounds, so not fishing in breeding grounds or breeding areas, so that the fish are actually free to reproduce. And also mesh size. By mesh size we mean the size of the holes in these nets. So you can see that this bigger fish is going to be caught in the mesh size, but the smaller fish will get through the mesh or through the holes, and importantly that will allow it to grow. And if it's allowed to grow, not only will it be bigger, but it will be able to reproduce as well. So these are efforts that are being made in order to try and maintain the fish stocks in the oceans. Now the problem with this, of course, is that it's hard to measure and control this and to check every single boat that's gone out to see how much they've caught and whether they're in their quota, and it can be hard to make sure that people are using the right kind of mesh size, right net sizes, and basically it's not always easy to sort of control all these, because people might get away with doing that and not be caught out. So these are things you need to kind of consider in terms of how we get food from fish farming. The last thing I want to cover is to do with a substance called mycoprotein. And mycoprotein is a source of food that comes from a fungus, a type of fungus, and this fungus is very high in protein and very low in fat. And because of that, some people use it as a meat substitute, and it contains all the lots of different kinds of amino acids that are required for protein and very low in fat, so some people see it as healthy. One of the things you need to know are the conditions under which it is grown. So here is a diagram of an example of how it might be grown. It looks kind of complicated, but it's not as complicated as it may look. Firstly, the thing that we need to know and remember is that the fungus, the mycoprotein, it's called, actually we should give it a name, it's called Fusarium, and it's grown in aerobic conditions. In other words, we require oxygen for it to grow. So the oxygen is provided just from air, it's not pure oxygen. The air goes into this fermentation vessel that we have, it bubbles through the mixture, and that provides oxygen. We do have a filter here to prevent any bacteria from getting in, because if bacteria got in there, they could contaminate, they could overtake the growth, they could compete with the fusarium, or they could contaminate it, and there might be harmful bacteria. But we have air that goes in that's filtered, that provides the oxygen for the aerobic respiration. The air also has the job, or has the function of mixing all the glucose syrup and minerals and the fungus that are in there, and also distributing the heat that's generated in there. But we'll talk about that a bit more in a sec. So we've got air going in, providing oxygen and mixing everything up. We've got our glucose syrup, which is the food, and some minerals which help the growth that goes in the other end. We've got the air that we said, and eventually, after a period of time, we have our mycoprotein, which is our food source that is produced and comes out at another point in the fermentation vessel. As we know, aerobic respiration produces carbon dioxide, so that can escape from the top here. And the last thing to mention is that because this is aerobic respiration, it produces heat, and in fact it produces a lot of heat, and if the temperature goes above around about 35 to 37 degrees, that could slow the growth of this fusarium fungus, and we don't want the temperature to go too high. So what we have is often a system for cooling or keeping the whole fermentation vessel cool. Now in this example here, we've got what's called a water jacket, cooling water jacket. And basically, cool water goes in, it surrounds the main pot where the fermentation is happening, or the fermenter is actually working, and the water will cool off what's going on in here, so this temperature inside the fermenter doesn't get too high, and that's just a constant stream of cool water that keeps the temperature at lower levels. As we said, it's important that only the fusarium grows in here, so in between growing the fusarium we do sterilize with steam before we start growing. We might also filter the air, as we said, and also the mycoprotein that comes out, we might also sterilize that or heat it up to kill any unwanted bacteria that might have got in. But generally the things you need to remember are that it's aerobic conditions, we have glucose syrup and minerals that go in, and the temperature needs to be kept quite under control because it can get very warm in here. Don't mix this up with your biogas generator where we have anaerobic conditions and we insulate in order to try and keep the heat in, because we don't get as much heat produced in that system. Okay, so lots to take on board there. You may need to watch this video once or twice just to get it under your belt, but other than that, that's me done for this video. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you again soon.